this video, we're going to take a second and go back over everything we've looked at in this unit to get ready for our upcoming quiz. So, what was in this unit? Well, we started with mean, median, mode, and range, right? And we didn't really talk a whole lot about range, but we did talk a lot about the mean, median, and mode. Remember, your mean is the average. Okay, so to find it by hand, we add up everything and then divide by the number of data points we have in that set. The median is the middle. Remember, for the median, it needs to be in numerical order, and you cross off from the outside and work your way down to the inside. And whatever's in the middle is your median. And then if you have two numbers, you take the average of those two to find the very middle of that data set. The mode is the one that occurs most often. You can have no mode, you can have multiple modes, or just one. It just depends on the data set, but you don't have to have a mode. And then the range is your max minus your min. You want to know how much your data spans. So we're talking max minus min. Sometimes it's better to use the mean or median or the mode depending on what type of information you're looking at. Generally speaking, the mean is going to be a pretty good summary of what's going on with our data. You know, talking about the average of the class test scores or something. But if we have what we call outliers, then it's going to skew our data one way or another, and the median might be the better choice. So if you do have outliers, sometimes looking at the middle of your data is a little more accurate to see about where everybody falls. Sometimes if you have data that's not numerical, right, that might be a mode, or if you have one number that's repeated a lot, then the mode might be the better way of looking at your data. Then we moved into Q1, Q3, and Iqr. So your Q1 is just the median of the lower half of your data. The Q3 is the median of the upper half of your data. All right, so remember, we're dividing into quarters, so we're taking our data and dividing it into fourths. So the middle, the half and half, is going to be our median, and then half of the lower half is Q1, half of the upper half is Q3. You find those the same way we find our median, by putting everything in numerical order. Find your median first, and then start crossing off. You do not include the median whenever you're crossing off to find the Q1 and Q3. The IQR is the interquartile range. So to find the IQR, we do Q3 minus Q1. Now, the IQR is an important value for us when we're looking for our outliers. Right? Remember, we have to find that magic number when we work with outliers. So we take our IQR and we multiply it by 1.5. And whatever that magic number is, we subtract it from Q1 and add it to Q3, and anything outside of that range is an outlier. So we got to find that magic number of 1.5 times the IQR. We talked a little bit about standard deviation. We talked about the long way of finding it. And remember, standard deviation is just looking at how each of your pieces of the data set deviate from the mean. So we're looking on average how far everything is away from the middle number. So it's kind of like the average of all of your deviations. Okay, so the standard deviation, remember, we have our symbol. And then to find the variance, we square it. Okay, so this is standard deviation, and then variance would be our standard deviation squared. We don't talk a whole lot about variance. We mostly stick with standard deviation. Luckily, we have a calculator that will do all of this for us. So real quick, to review it on the calculator. To start with, you've got to enter in your data. So we would turn it on and go to Stat, Edit. And in L1, we put in all of our data. Alright, once we have all of our data in, and I'll just put some numbers in here so that we have something to go off of. Okay, so now if I want to find all of this information we've been talking about, I'm going to go to Stat, Calc, and I want that first one variable stats. I'm going to let it load. That X bar, that's our mean, right? And then remember that E looking shape, that's the sum of all of the data points. And then the sum of all of them squared, 169. This is like slowly working your way towards standard deviation. Remember, we have the two standard deviations. The first one is our population, and we want to use, or I'm sorry, the first one's a sample. The second one's a population, which is what we want to use. So we always want to use the second one. N is the number of terms we have in the data set. Then we've got our 5-number summary. Right, these 5 numbers right here, your minimum, your Q1, your median, Q3, and your max. Remember, your median is also Q2. So these are our 4 quarters, basically, when we take our data and cut it into the fourth. So that's our 5-number summary. Okay, again, looking right up here at the standard deviation, this is much easier to let your calculator do the work than it is to do it by hand, and this is completely fine. Then we looked at different ways of displaying data. We'll come back to that normal curve in a second. So we looked at different ways of displaying data, and again, your calculator will do some of them. So in order to look into your calculator, you got to turn your plot on. So we go to second y equals, turn that plot on. Then it asks you for the type. So all these types are some that we can use. So the first one is just your scatter plot, which we'll use when we do like regression, and we want to put in our L1 and L2 and see how they relate, maybe something over time. The one next to that is very similar, but it's a line graph, and that's also got to have an L1 and L2, X and Y, because you're looking at something over time. It's very similar to your scatter plot, but it just connects everything for you. And then if we keep going to the right, there's our histogram, where it will take and put your data into equal intervals and then show you the frequency your data is in each interval. And then we've got two box plot options. The first one has those dots, and the second one doesn't. So that first one is going to show you any outliers that you have, if you have any outliers. The second one is just going to show you your max, your min, and then your quartiles in between. Alright, so if this first one's the one that we use, so that the calculator will show us if we have outliers. So I'm going to press enter. We'll see if we have any outliers with this set. And then I'm going to go zoom 9. Okay, zoom 9 is zoom stat, so it's going to automatically adjust my window so that I can see everything in there. Alright, and it looks here like I don't have any outliers, but my minimum is also my Q1. Okay, now that's weird looking, but remember, this is just saying cutting your data into how it's into fourths, but not by numerical value, by how many data points are there. So this one I think I put a lot of 3s in, which means that there's a lot of 3s between my minimum and my Q1. It means all 3s, right? So 25% of my points are 3s, so that means my minimum and Q1 are the same. So here's my box and whisker. Alright, so stem and leaf plots you can't put on the calculator. So your stem and leaf plots are the ones where you kind of make a T-chart almost. And you might put your tens or your decimals, maybe, you know, your ones placed here. So maybe if we're working with decimals, might put a 1, and we'll say 2, 3, 2, 4, and then we'll skip up to 4, 1. And I'll make my key. Your key could be anything. So if I wanted this case, 1 and 0 to be 1.0. That means that my data would be a 1.2, a 1.3, 2.4, and 4.1. Remember, you don't skip over anything once you get your set pace. You do that all the way down. Alright, and you can also have a double or a back-to-back stem and leaf plot where we have something on this side. Maybe we're comparing two types of data sets. And we'll do a 4 and a 7. This side would be a 1.3 and 2.1s and 3.4 and a 3.7. So maybe we were comparing these two data sets. Okay, a histogram we talked about before. And remember, the biggest thing with histogram is it's very similar to a bar graph, but your histogram is going to have intervals on it. So across the bottom you might have 1 to 5, 6 to 11, and so on, whatever your intervals are, and they have to be equal intervals. Okay, you can't be changing the sizes. You want them to be the same all the way across. And it kind of goes along with your frequency tables, which is just the table that you have for your histogram. So on, one side you might have this interval of 1 to 5, and then you have your tallies of how many times, and then on this side we would put a 5. So that's your frequency table. We also looked at two-way tables and relative frequency tables, which the two-way tables when you have data going two different ways. So the one that we looked at, or one of the ones we looked at, was having a cell phone and not having a cell phone. A cell phone, not having a cell phone, MP3 and not having an MP3 player. And you always have to add in your totals. If it's not there for you, go ahead and make another column and row, but you need the totals. Right? So then if I plugged in some numbers, just make these up. My total MP3 players is over here, and that would be a 7 because you add them. And then we add these two, and it's also 7. Add these, and we get 5. Add these, and we get 9. Down here, this 14, that's going to be my grand total. That's how many people were included in this survey. Okay, to take this and make it percents is where we get our relative frequency table. To make your percent, you just take that number and divide it by the total. So we would do 4 divided by 14, get your decimal or your percent, and that would go there. That's the only difference with a two-way and a relative frequency table. The last thing we looked at, which it wasn't the most recent thing, but the last thing on my list here, is a normal curve and the empirical rule, right? And that just means that if data is distributed normally, it's going to follow that bell-shaped curve, where your mean is in the middle. Okay, there's our mean. And then we put in those standard deviations, whatever that standard deviation is. Okay, and then in the middle, we've got 68%. So within one standard deviation of your mean, there's 68% of your data. Within 2 is 95%, and then within 3 is 99.7%. And then you can go farther and break that down and get your individual standard deviations, but these are the main ones that you have to remember. So they'll ask you questions like, out of the 5,000 people that were tested, how many are within one standard deviation? So then you have to find 68% of 5,000 by doing 0.68 times 5,000. That's pretty much everything we've looked at, other than some, random questions based on those different types of displays, like the box and whisker and the stem and leaf and line graphs and all of that. So you've looked at putting all this stuff in, and again, the calculator does most of what we do for this class. So let the calculator help you. Just make sure you're comfortable using it so you can use it on your quiz next class.